Hey guys, welcome back. Section 1.2, we're going to be covering the different types of government. And you will be doing an additional project of sorts to go more in depth on this. But we're going to look at some general classifications today. So we'll be looking at 3 different characteristics by which we can classify types of government. We'll define systems of government by a basis of who can participate in the government. And then we'll look at how powers are distributed geographically, and we'll also look at the distribution of power between executive and legislative branches. So that is the law enforcing and lawmaking branches. So these are our 3 criteria for classifying governments. First, we have who can participate. Is it everyone? Like in the United States, we can all vote, we can all write our senators and representatives, we can all participate, right? Or is it like North Korea, where there's not a whole lot of participation besides from those that are really in charge? We'll look at geographic distribution of power. So is the government located centrally, like in one city, or is it kind of spread out? And then we have the relationship between the legislative and executive branches. How do those work? Are they kind of combined? Do they operate completely separately? All 3 of these classifications are going to help us determine what type of government a country has. So first, who can participate? Now we have 2 umbrella terms here. So there's democracies and there's dictatorships. And when I say that it's an umbrella term, I mean there's different types of democracies and there's different types of dictatorships. So a democracy is a government in which political authority rests with the people. That government is conducted only by and with the consent of the people. Without the consent of the people, that government ceases to exist. Okay? Now, the United States is going to fall into that democracy category. We'll talk about what type of democracy the United States is in just a minute. Then we have dictatorships, where rulers cannot be held responsible to the will of the people. There's no accountability. Now, a dictatorship might sound scary, right? And sometimes it is, but there are also examples of dictatorships that maybe are less severe than we think when we think dictatorship. So we'll start with democracy. We have 2 main types of democracies. Democracy literally means rule by the people. So the first is a direct or a pure democracy. This is a ancient Greek style of democracy where every citizen has a vote on everything. So if we lived in a direct democracy, we would be voting on policy, right? You and I would be voting on the new tax code, on new healthcare bills, right? All of those things. Direct democracies prove to be very difficult in countries of our size. I mean, they're not even used in cities of our size, right? Even in West Fargo, we elect people to vote on our behalf at city meetings and so on and so forth. And then we have an indirect democracy, and another word for that is republic. This is what the United States is today. As voters, we elect representatives to make decisions on policy for us, right? We don't have the time to be educated on every single issue and make an informed vote. We would rather vote for representatives who they can be the expert. They can do the research. It's their job to represent us. Now, direct democracies today, like I mentioned, can really only exist in a small situation, right? Like we could maybe do it in like our school, right? If there was like a certain thing we wanted to vote on, maybe like something with lunch or hats or whatever, we could vote on policy, right, in a building of our size. But an indirect democracy is really going to be essential for anything bigger than that, right? Some big cities, like cities the size of West Fargo even, are going to use more of an indirect democracy model, as well as our state governments and our federal government. All right, then we have dictatorships. Okay, so the opposite. Now we have a couple of pictures of different dictators from history here and some of their quotes. I'll just put on the screen for you for a moment, right? It's harmful for books to be read, right? How fortunate for government that people do not think. Here we have quotes about violence, right? Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. When we think about dictatorships, we often think of dictators like this, right? That have left a horrible like stain on human history. And they are certainly out there, right? You think of what we know about like North Korea today. It is unfortunately very common in dictatorships to use force and to really fight for a lack of education, because when people aren't educated, they don't know what they can do to change things, right? They don't know what they don't know. So, a few different types of dictatorships we're going to go over here. First, we have autocracies. Okay. In an autocracy, we have one individual leader. We also can have oligarchies, which is a small group of leaders. Now, oftentimes, oligarchies are militaristic. We probably think of North Korea as an autocracy with one individual leader, right, Kim Jong-un. However, he is surrounded by his close military generals, and so for that reason, it has also been classified as an oligarchy. We really don't know a ton about North Korea and how their government works, so there are kind of mixed stories on which one it is. But autocracy, you have one individual leader. Oligarchy, you have a small group of leaders, typically who are militaristic and sort of run the government together. All right, so you can see on this map here a number of different forms of government around the world. Another one that we haven't talked about yet are theocracies, which you can see in Iran on this map. A theocracy is technically a type of dictatorship as well, where you have a legal system that's based on religion and ran by religious leaders, right? So a priest or a pope or someone would be in charge of the government as well. It used to be more common than they are now, but they definitely still exist, as shown in the example on the map. Then we have geographic distribution of power. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to each of the three different types of geographic distribution. So you can have a unitary government, where we have a central government that creates little local units, and those local units are really only used for convenience sake. But the disadvantage of that then is that those local units really don't have any power. They're just there for convenience. A federal government, like we have in the United States, so we have a federal republic, we have a national government, and we have state governments as co-equal partners. Now, conflicts will inevitably arise between these two levels of government, and so we address that in our Constitution with something called the Supremacy Clause, which we'll talk about further in topic 3. And then we have a confederate government, where power pretty much solely belongs to the local or regional government, leaving the central government with pretty much no power. So some examples for you for a unitary system. We have centralized government. Unitary is the most common form of government in the world yet today. And one example would be the United Kingdom. So all of your government power is centralized under one government, right? They don't have little state governments like we do in the United States that are co-equal partners with the national government. It's just the centralized government. And you have federal, where, like I said, you have power divided between central and local governments. And your example of that is the United States, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and like 23 other nations use this division of power. Now, in the United States division of power, the Constitution is the final law when it comes to disputes between the states and the national government. And then we have a confederation, which is more or less an alliance of independent states. There are not many confederations around today. They are very rare because there's just a total lack of power. And so the closest thing I can think of is like a modern day example would maybe be like the European Union or the United Nations would be maybe another example. We're going to talk in the coming units about the Articles of Confederation, which is kind of the first form of government that the United States operates under after winning the Revolutionary War. It was short-lived, only made it about 10 years, and that's really the reason that confederations are rare. There's just a lack of power, and most of the time they don't work out. In the United States, oftentimes our local, state, and federal officials will work together, as pictured in this image. And then our final classification is legislative and executive branches. So those are lawmaking and law executing or law enforcing agencies. In a presidential government, which we have in the United States, you have separation of powers between the executive and the legislative. The two entities operate independently and they are seen as co-equals, right? One is not more powerful than the other. Now there's some conflicts with this, right? Like, say you have Democrats that control Congress and a Republican in the White House. When they both have to work together to make and enforce laws, it can make the whole process really slow because there's things that they don't agree on. So it has its disadvantages. The other option is a parliamentary government, where the executive branch is actually made up of members from the legislative branch. As a result, the legislative branch is subject to the direct control of the executive. So in the United Kingdom, for example, in their parliament, their prime minister, which is their executive, is chosen from the parliament. And all the cabinet members, all the people that help him out as executive, come from the parliament, the legislative branch. So that makes government work more efficiently because the party that's in charge is in charge of both branches all the time, but it can also lead to more corruption. So that's one of the concerns with a parliamentary system, though it is much more efficient at times than the presidential system. All right, that is 1.2. Please let me know if you have any questions.